class. So I'm getting ready to start my 2-color relief print for Project 5 in our class. I have a sketch, or took a sketch from my sketchbook and traced it onto tracing paper. So I'm combining different elements that I took from the story you guys are listening to for inspiration. And then I just kind of quickly, made sure that I had it placed on my block. And then I taped it down so that I have, again, just a hinge so that I can put it back where I need to if part of it doesn't transfer. And that way I can make sure that I'm transferring it. So I am going to switch the video into time lapse for transferring. And so this is just a graphite tracing of my sketch from my sketchbook. This is a ballpoint pen. Anything that's kind of harder than a pencil will work better than a pencil. But I could also do this with the transfer with a pencil. I've just found ballpoint pen works better. So I'm going to transfer the graphite onto here, and then I'm going to redraw it with Sharpie to have something that's permanent. And then I'll do my contrast staining of the block. So I'm going to do a lot of this in time lapse because I'm assuming that you guys have watched the tutorials for Project 3 and Project 4. So you don't need to hear explanations for some of this stuff, and you can go back and watch those tutorials again if you do, as opposed to me making another really long video about parts of this process that you've already done for your 1-color collagraph print and your 1-color relief print that you did for Project 4. So yeah, I'll switch it in time lapse. I'll do the steps so you guys can watch me do them as a visual reminder of the steps. But until this block is cut, nothing is really going to be different about the process. And once I cut this block, I'll probably film a little bit more explanation, and I'll transfer this print onto this block. So I could always trace this on here as well, but if it shifts or there's any little changes in the drawing when I cut it, that won't be represented in that transfer. So if I transfer this image onto the block, cut it, I can pull a really kind of quick proof or print, and then actually transfer that print onto here. And I'll go over those steps when I get to that point. But yeah, enjoy the time lapse. Alright you guys, so I have my key block cut, and you can see that I made some choices to leave some of the block whole. And I did that for two reasons. One, to kind of balance out the solid black of the shirt of the figure here on the bottom of the image, to have some black at the top to kind of balance the composition a little bit. I thought would visually help. The other reason I did it is that what we're going to do to get the image onto our second block is we're actually going to do a transfer, which means that I'm going to print this and then take that print and transfer the print onto this block. So to have all four corners, or as many of the four corners printing as possible, would help me line the print from this up to that block. And so I'm going to do that as a demo. I don't know that I'm going to be able to talk about the process as I'm doing it, because I'm going to need to print rather quickly onto a sheet of paper and then transfer that still wet ink onto this block. When I'm doing this in the studio at school, I'm using oil-based inks, and it's really easy because that ink takes a week or two to dry completely. So I have a lot of extra time to transfer the print from this block onto this block. But since we're using the acrylic inks, I'm going to attempt to do it. And I'm just going to have to move really quickly from printing this, the step of printing this, to transferring it onto this. So I'm going to do it for you guys, in front of you guys, but I might not be talking while I'm doing it, just as a FYI. So what I need to get prepared to do that transfer is I actually need to set up as if I was going to print. So I'm going to put you guys, switch the camera to time lapse and do that rather quickly, so you guys don't have to watch me do it in real time. And we'll go through the transfer. But once I have that image transferred onto this block, I can then draw on top of it and figure out what areas I want to cut. So the trick with the chiaroscuro block is that this image is going to have more negative areas cut out, because this is my sort of black, and then all the open areas will be the color of the paper if I were to do it one color. And then I will have the second block to use for a lighter color to then accentuate or create highlights in this image. So this block I won't cut nearly as much. And the reason I want to transfer from this block to this block is that then they'll line up more exactly, as opposed to if I take my transfer and actually transfer that on here. Again, getting it to line up exactly in the same place is a lot harder than you think it's going to be. It's really inexact, and so you end up with kind of like a vibrating thing that happens in your print, where this image on this block doesn't line up with the image from this block, even if you're lining up the corners exactly. And the reason for that is that when you're cutting your image, it kind of changes a little bit. When you're transferring the image, the paper flexes or stretches a little bit, so sometimes your marks are a little bit distorted, and they'll be distorted slightly differently on the second block when you go to transfer it a second time. But if I am unable to do the water-based ink transfer from this block to this block, then we might just have to settle for doing a transfer, like a trace transfer again, in which case I would really just kind of transfer just the contour lines, the outer edges of the different parts of the image, to kind of then help me print my, or cut for my lighter color. So again, this block is the block that I'm going to spend most of the time cutting. This block is going to have a lot less cutting, and because my color is going to be really light printed from this block once it's cut, this darker color can sit on top of that, and the areas that I cut from here will show up as white, whereas the tone that I print will show up as kind of a mid-tone or mid value. So, when I think about it, I'll probably cut out more of the skull, because skulls I think of as being kind of a light gray or white when they're bleached. Some areas of the, in the face of the figure, and then maybe just a little bit inside the dragon, but I might leave all the negative space flat and print that with this block, just again to kind of push things forward. If there's more cutting in the foreground, the other elements will tend to fall back because they'll have this light color underneath it. Another thing to keep in mind is I don't need to cut the areas where this image will print. So I don't need to cut a reverse. Sometimes students will do that because they think they need to make room for this to print onto the paper. This block will print directly on top of the ink from this block. So I don't need to cut a negative line for where these areas are going to hit or anything like that. The transfer is just to show me where this image will line up on this block so that I can cut different marks out from this block. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's kind of confusing, but once you see the process, I think it makes a lot more sense. So again, I'm going to switch you guys into time lapse. I'll set up my printing station, and I will do the transfer. All right, guys, so I have my printing station set up with my plexiglass for my ink to roll out, my wax paper to keep my workstation clean when I accidentally roll off the block with the ink. Just, helps with cleanup. Again, this ink we're using is really handy because it can be mostly cleaned up with just water. A little bit of like 409 or Fantastic helps as well, but honestly, just water, maybe a little bit of dish soap should do it. So you shouldn't have any issues. But I want my ink knife to mix up my ink. I want my spoon to do my printing. I want my homemade brayer made from a pool noodle with a cheap, 4-inch house, roller from house painting roller from Walmart. So we should be good to go. A little bit of daily moisturizer for my ink to keep it from drying so quickly. So again, once I start printing, I don't know that I'll be able to concentrate enough on doing that quickly and narrate over what I'm doing. But I'm just going to describe it really briefly. So I'm going to mix up some ink. Again, as if I was going to print. I'm going to roll up my block. I'm going to print on paper. And then I'm really quickly going to lay that print down flat, face up. I'm going to set this block on top of it so that it lines up with the corners, that I have that are printing here. And then I'm going to flip it over with the paper on top really carefully. And then I'm going to go ahead and spoon it as if I was printing. And what that should do is that should transfer the ink that's on the paper back onto this block right here. And it might be kind of faint or a little light, but I don't need a ton of, I don't need it to be really rich and dark. I just needed enough of it kind of faintly on here so that I can draw back on top of it with a pencil or a marker once that ink's dry to sort of plan out where I'm going to cut that, that second color for my 2-color image into it. All right, so I want that kind of close at hand and ready to go. Since this print that I'm pulling is just going to be a proof, I could use newsprint. I wouldn't use anything super absorbent, so I really think like newsprint drawing paper would be really good, or cheap sketchbook paper or something like that. I happen to have a piece of Japanese paper that's left over from my last demo, so I'm going to use that just because I have it as prepared to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that. But maybe copy paper. Maybe actually I'll grab a piece of copy paper and just use that because that'll go pretty quick. So yeah, I'm going to mix up my ink. So sorry, yeah, I kind of changed my mind on the fly there. I'll use, I have some 11x17 just like tabloid, like printer paper, probably a regular sheet from a regular, 8.5x11 letter size sheet would work just fine. But I'm thinking that would be better than the Japanese paper because it's not nearly as absorbent. So it's not going to let the ink penetrate it, so the ink will sit on the surface and then transfer onto my second block a little bit easier is my hope. Fingers crossed. All right, so I got my paper. Got my ink mostly mixed up. I want to get that skin lotion nice and sort of mixed in there. So the ink is a lot looser with that moisturizing lotion in there. But that should keep it from drying too quickly. Probably a little too much ink on the block this first time, which will make it print a little bit, the lines a little bit fatter or darker than I necessarily want them to. But that should help with the transfer. it seems like it's evened out. I feel like I need a little bit more ink. Surprised. I guess that makes sense. This is the first time I'm putting ink on the block, and linoleum doesn't absorb the ink in the same way that wood does. And I know I've mentioned that in the past, that the block or the matrix is sometimes a little thirsty. It'll kind of suck the oil out of the ink and make it a little bit harder to transfer the image that first time. So your first print is usually a little bit lighter than the rest of them are going to be. And I like the kind of horizontal marks there made by the cutting. Not to congratulate myself or anything, but just I cut it that way hoping that they would show up in kind of a pattern, you know, across the horizon of the image. But when you're cutting, you just never know, or at least I don't ever really feel like I know how deep I need to, or shallow I need to leave it to get that to happen. So it's always kind of a happy accident a little bit. All right, so I'm going to set this paper on there, push it down with my hands, hit it with the spoon. Should get something that looks almost like a rubbing. Oops. Hopefully that's got enough ink. I don't want to do this very long. I know I would spoon it longer if I were printing on good paper and I was trying to make a good print of it. But I think getting a rough print quickly is probably better to have ink that's still wet. So there's my print. Like I said, I'm just going to set this block on top of that. I'm going to flip it so I can see these sort of two printed corners. And I just want to kind of get at an angle from the side and look at it and make sure it's sort of lining up there. So like I said, I'm just going to kind of slide it off the edge of my table carefully with one hand on the block, one hand underneath it holding the paper, flip it over, just kind of push it down with my hand a little bit. And then I'll go ahead and repeat that sort of spooning action as if I were pulling ink from the block, but instead I'm hopefully pushing ink from the paper onto the block. And I want to do this quickly enough that the ink doesn't really dry or dry the paper down, which may happen. If that does, I would probably just wait for the ink to dry a little bit longer and then just wash the paper off, because the paper will just dissolve in water. Hopefully the ink, if it is given time to set up, won't wash off, because it'll want to dry kind of permanent. All right. Okay, there we go. We got kind of a light impression, which I mentioned earlier is good. I don't need more than that. I do have a proof I could keep for myself, you know, if it was on good paper. All right, so I don't need the ink anymore right away. I can put it away in like a saran wrap. You know, sometimes I'll start in saran wrap and then I can just poke a hole in it and squeeze it out like a toothpaste tube and then use that ink to print. Remember, I can clean this all up with water when I'm done with this step. I could leave my printing station out. I know some of you guys are probably working in tight spaces, so you could also put it away while you're just kind of planning this and drawing on top of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this ink, the black ink, dry on here because it's still a little wet. So I'll probably give it maybe an hour or two, and then I will come back and probably in time lapse I'll just rub it up with a little bit of that cutting contrast, a little bit of red paint on top of it, and we'll go from there. And I'll start either drawing on this with a Sharpie. Again, I want to wait till this ink is dry because I don't want to draw directly, or I could use graphite like a pencil or something that's reflective, so I should be able to see it on top of this black if I need to. I suppose I could draw onto it with white pencils as well if I have some laying around. But that's it. That's our transfer. So that's the first major step. of doing this. Like I said, I'll put some cutting contrast, some red acrylic paint on this, or tempera. Um, I'll draw on top of it either with a Sharpie, white pencil, regular graphite pencil to help me plan out where I want to cut my highlights into this image. And then I'll cut it, and then we'll be ready to print it. So most of your time is going to be spent cutting the key block because this one will cut faster. But again, you just want to be planning time. You know, you want to be scheduling your time where you're giving things time between runs to dry and all that sort of stuff. This ink dries really quick, but I don't want to try drawing directly on top of this or cutting it right now because I'll just get ink sort of smeared everywhere. But I think after like an hour, this will be completely dry, and I can work into it without getting it all over my hands or all over everything else. All right. Alright, you guys, so at the end of my last video, I scrubbed the ink and white pencil off of this block that I was using to tell me where to cut, which makes it really hard to see where I've cut on the block now. But once I pull a proof of this block and then this on top of it, I'll be able to see how they line up, and I can cut more from this block. It's always easier to remove information than it is to put it back. So I didn't cut too much, hoping that I can see how they look, and then I'll kind of go from there. I'm going to use some colors. I think I'm going to make a really light green, add some of the Daily Moisturizer to it to retard the drying time. You guys have already seen me pull proofs in relief, so I'm going to switch it into time lapse so you guys can watch it in high speed. I'll probably use a little bit of black to make my green kind of gray, but yeah, I'm set up with my printing station still. I'll get my paper ready. It's better to print all of your pieces of paper with this first block, but I'm going to go ahead and do one by itself, and then I'll print the other on top of it to see how it looks first, just to make sure. But generally, once you know what they look like, you print, 6 pieces of paper with this block, and then 6 pieces of paper, on top of those same 6 pieces of paper, you print this block, and you're good to go. So some of the demo video for when I was printing my lightest block for my Chiaroscuro block got lost because I was using my cell phone, and I guess I got a FaceTime call for my son from his cousin, and it turns off my video when that happens, and I didn't realize it because I couldn't hear it, like it didn't ring or anything. But regardless, I think you got to see a little bit of me getting ready to make this. Like I was mixing the ink and I started to print it. You guys are going to see me print an edition of these, so I'm going to go ahead and when I click it into time lapse in a minute, I'm going to go ahead and print all of this lighter color. So I'm going to have to remix my ink to do that. I found printing the second color on top of it was actually easier because the paper's already kind of absorbed some ink, and so the second color, the black, the dark green, or line block on top of it was much easier to print. Took a lot less pressure and went a little bit quicker. I went ahead and pulled a proof of the key block in that dark green by itself, just so you can have kind of a contrast of how it looks without the undercolor and how it looks with the undercolor, which is almost kind of like money-ish green to me, kind of because of the gray quality, and also the color of the paper, which I kind of like an aspect of that. color scheme. But I apologize for losing that that video. But I'm going to clean up my dark green and my brayer by just rinsing it off in the sink. And then I'll mix some new color, and I've got more paper over here on the side ready to print, and I'll go ahead and print my lightest block, and then I'll print my darkest block on top of those as well. But overall, happy with it. At this point, after pulling a proof, I could decide like that green needs to be slightly darker. I thought it was going to be too dark, to be honest, until I printed the key on top of it, and then I can see that there's enough contrast there. I kind of maybe wish it was a little bit more green, but I'll tweak it a little bit as I'm setting up or mixing my color, and see if I can push it just a little bit more green without it getting too dark, just to give it a little bit more of a contrast to the paper. Although I am liking how it looks with the dark green, so maybe I'll try to replicate it as close as possible, just because I'm kind of happy with the result, and there's no reason to tweak it too much. But you guys can kind of see the prints, and yeah, I'll go ahead and addition my lighter green. Between colors, I think I let these prints dry for about an hour before I printed my darker green on top of it. That seems like it's probably more than enough time, unless you're using way too much skin lotion to, you know, reduce or retard the drying time on your lighter color. It should dry really quickly. Like this is completely dry to the touch, of course, because it's been about an hour. But it probably is dry in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, to be honest. You just want to check it. Like if you put your finger on it and it comes up with the lighter green, then it's still wet, which this isn't. It's coming, you know, I have a little bit of the darker green on my fingers from printing, but the lighter green's completely dry. All right. Addition here, I had a couple printing problems, and I can tell you what went wrong. I think I didn't wait long enough for my first color to dry because I put so much of that skin cream in it that it really needed, you know, maybe 12 hours. Like I needed to let it sit overnight before I did my second color. Because I didn't, you can kind of see some of these prints are patchy, and I'll take some photos like I usually do at the end of my demos, where I'll pan the camera across it, and you'll see little sort of like salty patches. You might also notice like some where the paper started to stick to the ink. And the reason that happened was that the color, the lighter color, the first color was still kind of damp, and so I was having to use a little bit more pressure to get the ink from my key block to transfer. And in doing that, it took longer to spoon it to get it to transfer because I was having to go over it again and again. And it also was causing issues with the paper getting really soft that I was printing on. This paper getting really soft because I was going, you know, sort of wet on wet. So you maybe noticed at one point during the time-lapse video that I put a piece of old newsprint. This has just got some old information on it from old prints. On top of the back of my paper, and I was spooning that. And I was doing that because the ink was starting to sort of soak through, and I could tell that the paper was tearing, and that's just wetness from the ink. So if I'd let the first color dry a little bit longer, I probably would have had slightly better results. But overall, I'm pretty happy with them. And again, I think the slight tearing and sticking to the block, you guys maybe can't see with the camera, that it's kind of something I can see just because the dimensionality of seeing it in person. But just a couple tips, let that first color dry a little bit longer if you need to. And then if you're having some of the same issues I'm having, where I can see the ink kind of the second color coming through the paper when I'm spooning it, you can use a piece of newsprint, or sketchbook paper or something like that. Just some scrap paper to relieve the friction of the spoon directly against the back of the paper so you don't tear your printing paper. You just are kind of using this as a go-between, to kind of keep a smooth surface that you're running the spoon against. All right, so I'll take a picture of the prints like I said I would, panning across it so you guys can see some of the areas where there was issues. Especially right here on this one where it was especially wet still, where it just didn't take any ink. But I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll talk about it in the Zoom.